Hello. I had another live video earlier today. I had to take a break and drink some tea because my throat was getting a little sore. Um, but I am back now to read chapter 13. Chapter 13. Too quiet told him on that chilly morning in Turin that a man could die from silence. Nick would have scoffed. Now, 2 days later, he would merely nod and agree, because she was ripping his heart out bit by agonizing bit, all without so much as a word. He deserved it, of course. He'd been so terrified of what might happen to her that he'd latched on to the first solution that sprang to mind, never thinking he might be the one terrifying her. He hated that he might have done just that. And even though he'd altered her plans, he would never destroy her life's work. He would see her all the way to India, as she desired. But safely, out of sight of any enemies. Her safety was worth the price. He'd seen no suspicious persons since deviating from her intended course, and she'd received no messages, threatening or otherwise. If he had to go back, he would do the same thing all over again, even if she never forgave him. Berries danced down the street, reenacting some ancient Roman battle or festival or whatever it was the Colosseum had sparked in her thoughts to him. She seized joy wherever she went, but unlike in Paris, she would share none of it with him. He led the way to her guidebook, pretending not to care, and knowing she saw right through him. They reached the door at the same moment as another couple, all four of them halting to avoid crowding the entrance. "Excuse me," the other woman said. "Oh, you speak English," Berries answered with a smile. "Yes, we are American. Come, we must share a table." Nick started to shake his head, but Berries nodded enthusiastically, grinning at everyone except him. He grimaced and flipped open his pocket watch, using his old habits to distract from the hitch in his breath every time she turned away from him. 4 days, 16 hours, 9 minutes. It felt longer. Paris seemed a lifetime ago, Turin nearly so. He'd stumbled upon a wild crowd of potion drinkers there and nearly relapsed again. Thoughts of her had sustained him. Worry for her. He hadn't slept that night, too busy making the arrangements to prevent her from getting on that train. Selfish bastard. You did this to keep her close as much as to protect her. He snapped the watch closed. 3 days, 17 hours since we kissed. 2 days, 5 hours since she last spoke to me. He ran a finger absently across his cheek. The sting of her slap had long since faded, but he would welcome it back in a heartbeat, just to feel her touch on his skin. "It's always such a pleasure to meet a fellow English speaker," gushed the American woman. "Indeed," agreed the man with her. "We're Mr. and Mrs. Holbeck from Delaware, and you are?" He looked straight at Nick. Damnation. He still didn't know Barry's real name. How in hell was he supposed to introduce her? "I'm, Nick Masterson, and, I'm Miss Masterson, his sister," she said, before he could do anything idiotic like introducing her as his wife again. Though that's how they were registered at the hotel. He wasn't going to let anyone treat her with disrespect for traveling alone with a man. He'd forced her into the situation, therefore it was his responsibility to see that no harm came to her because of it. "Lovely to meet you," the American woman replied. "Have you been in Rome long?" "We only arrived last night from Florence," Barry answered. "Oh, Florence is so lovely. I hope you were able to see some of the sights." "I was. The Galleria degli Uffizi was amazing, and the Duomo was more fantastically beautiful than I'd ever imagined." And yet it had paled in comparison, with the golden-haired beauty standing beside it. Nick remembered every detail, the wonder shining in her blue eyes, the way she twirled in her pink dress, laughing at how she matched the bits of pink marble in the facade, her sweet mouth opening to say something to him in her excitement, then snapping abruptly closed, telling him more than any words could that he had no right to her friendship. "Oh, and I was able to see the Venus on the half-shell painting in person," she continued, leading their party to a nearby table. "I mean Botticelli's Birth of Venus, of course. She's standing on half a shell, like some oyster, so that's what we called it. My brothers used to giggle over the reproduction in our art book because she was naked. It was terribly silly, but I thought it a beautiful painting, and I'm so happy to have seen it." "Eh, Masterson?" Nick glowered. He'd been enjoying the enthusiastic recounting of their sightseeing, content to pretend she was talking to him. Damn Mr. Hole whatever from somewhere in America and his disruptive conversation. Not knowing what the question was, Nick made a non-committal grunt, hoping the snub-nosed American would interpret it as he liked. "Women do prattle on," Snubnose said with a shake of his head. Nick put the full weight of his aristocratic upbringing behind his condescending scowl. "I rather like it." Berries lifted her eyes to his, and for an instant the world narrowed to the two of them, nothing more than the shared look and the ghost of a smile on her lips. She glanced away, severing the connection. He would need more than a few kind words to earn her forgiveness. He would need to give her the world. If only he knew what bits of it the world she wanted. "Will you be in Rome long?" Mrs. Snubnose asked. "Oh, no," Berries replied. "We set out from Brindisi after lunch tomorrow. We will see the sights today, and a bit in the morning, assuming I can drag Mr. Masterson out of bed at a reasonable time." "You have dragged me out of bed every day this week." He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper night's sleep. "Do you know people with morning difficulties, Mrs. Holbeck?" she continued, as if he weren't there. "I don't understand it myself. I can't sleep at all once the sun begins to rise, so I may as well get up and begin the day, don't you think?" "And she does this without the benefit of coffee," Nick added. She ignored him, turning the conversation to the merits and hazards of train travel. "Tease me," he pleaded silently. "Poke fun at me, scream at me, slap me again, anything." "Dashed fine wine they have in this country, don't you think?" Snubnose drawled. Nick checked his watch. 4 days, 16 hours, 19 minutes. Berries joined him on his visit to the Marquise de Merlot, out of curiosity more than anything, he suspected. She didn't say, of course. Nick could see the stiffness in her shoulders and her fidgety movements as she struggled not to say anything to him that wasn't strictly necessary. His punishment was no easy task for her, yet she persisted. He admired her tenacity, which only exacerbated his own anguish. "Westfield didn't mention you would bring a friend." The Marquis gestured at the chairs in front of his massive desk. "Please, have a seat." "She's his wife, according to the hotel logbook." Nick jumped, his head swiveling to locate the unsuspected voice. In the corner of the room, a young man perused a bookshelf, his black-clad figure obscured by the shadows. "Henry, stop skulking," the Marquis said. "I enjoy skulking. Did you wish to know the young lady's real name, or shall we pretend she's Mrs. Masterson?" "Please, God, tell me her name. I swear to recite it over and over until I remember." "I'm Nick's sister, Miss Masterson, today," she said primly. Nick stifled a groan. "Now, I understand you have some sort of report. What can you tell us? Is serum really running out?" And just like that, he found himself left out of his own conversation. Berries and the Marquis reviewed price comparisons, delivery reports, testimonies from local merchants and consumers, about a dozen papers in all. He let them talk, having nothing in particular to contribute. The numbers validated his observations. Potions were weakening and serum supplies dwindling. This was just what he needed to make his report to Parliament. Half his task was done. Tomorrow he would set out for India to determine whether he could identify a reason for the problem, and get Berries back on her desired path, though now with first-class accommodations, and no more trouble from her mysterious from his seat. "Well, this has been an excellent conversation. Please give my regards to Ilston, and let me know if you learn anything further. I'm still holding out hope that the situation is only temporary, and order will soon be restored." He helped Berries up from her seat, clasping her hand in his. "It has been wonderful to meet you, Miss Masterson." She smiled back at him. "It was a pleasure, my lord." "The pleasure is all mine, I assure you." He looked down at her in a contemplative way, tossing a glance at his skulking son. Nick's whole body tensed. If the Marquis thought to make a match between Berries and that short, blonde, freckled face— Skulker stared down into his book, pretending not to notice. Not interested. Good. Nick didn't want to have to fight for her. He wasn't particularly good at fisticuffs, to be perfectly honest. He preferred a battle of wits, or better yet, a battle of aesthetic. He gestured at the door. "Let's be on our way, Berries. I'd like to show you more of the city." She glanced up at him, and again he felt that split-second connection before she looked away. He wasn't sights to see and little time to see them, I'm afraid, she told Merlot. "We must take our leave of you. Thank you for your help. We'll be in touch." "We will be in touch," Nick echoed once they were alone. "Have you gone and made yourself—" "You forced me to it. If you didn't want me participating, perhaps you should have considered that before you kidnapped me." Nick found himself smiling. That was the longest sentence she'd said to him in 2.5 days. "I'm happy to have your participation." "Humph. What would you like to see next? The Pantheon, perhaps?" She popped open her reticule and handed him a slip of paper. "Here is the itinerary." She ran him ragged for the remainder of the day, but Nick preferred it that way. The busier she kept him, the less he dwelt on his troubles. And as much as it smarted when she ignored him, he still managed to absorb some of her delight at seeing a new part of the world. He returned to the hotel with a bit more hope than he had left with that morning. Nick walked her up to their adjoining rooms, with a connecting door that may as well have been a wall, thinking to see her safely locked in for the night before going out on his own for a bit. 10 p.m. was far too early for him to sleep. He rounded the corner and stopped short. A man lounged against the wall beside his door. Putting himself in front of Barry's to shield her from possible harm, he continued on, reaching into his coat for a nasty potion to spray on the man if necessary. The man turned, and Nick relaxed. Lord What's-His-Face's skulking son. Newlyweds with separate bedchambers? The young man shook his head in mock sorrow. How tragic. Barry sniffed. Traitorous husbands don't deserve the company of a loving wife. Her frosty smile speared Nick right through the chest. He hated that he had hurt her, despised it, despised himself, but he didn't know what else he could have done. What do you want, Freckles? He snapped, venting his anger on the inoffensive man. Does your father have more papers for us, or are you merely being a pest? I thought you might wish to know you're being followed. Nick blinked. Followed? By whom? He thought back over their day, but could recall nothing suspicious. They doubtless encountered some of the same people at multiple sites, but no one stuck out in his memory. Man of average height and build, dark brown hair, light brown eyes, possibly blue or gray, hard, square jaw, snub nose. Barry's gasped. The American? He's not an American. The accent is fake. Who is he, then? Nick demanded. Freckles shrugged. No idea, but I thought you should know. Take care. He nodded to them. Sharp. Miss Masterson. Quit. Nick's brain groped for the distant memory. Quigley? Quincy? No, what was it? Nick! Barry's clutched his arm, but the distress in her voice ruined any pleasure he might have taken in her touch. I told them all our travel plans. He cursed. So much for keeping her safe. And for those of you who have read the other books, you may have recognized that that was Henry, who was skulking and then giving them the advice. See you tomorrow with the next chapter.